It is, of course, naive to think that the number of copies an author happens to sell has any correlation with his or her literary standing. Hello one and all, and welcome back to the Library of the Weird. Surprise, surprise, I want to talk to you about another horror short story collection. This is American Supernatural Tales. It was compiled by S.T. Joshi, released in 2007 by Penguin, and it's about 407 pages long. There are 26 stories in here, of only American authors. For example, there's stories of H.P. Lovecraft, Edgar Allan Poe, Shirley Jackson, and Stephen King in there, just to name a few. The stories were compiled by S.T. Joshi, who is an American author and mostly known as a Lovecraft scholar. He's written many papers on Lovecraft and his works, and wrote actually 2 biographies, one of which is I Am Providence, which is, I think, the most famous Lovecraft biography. And he's also kind of infamous for strongly criticizing the decision by the American Fantasy Awards to remove a Lovecraft bust as an award, and he has quite the disdain for modern authors. I just want to read you one section in his introduction. It's about Stephen King. It is, of course, naive to think that the number of copies an author happens to sell has any correlation with his or her literary standing, and the majority of King's writing is indeed marred by clumsy prose, hackneyed conceptions derived from film, comics, and other media, and a rather dreary prolificy that does not bode well for the endurance of his work. Then he talks about King's success being the end for short stories, for horror short stories. And on the next page, he writes, Dean R. Koontz, on the other hand, can take his place with Judith Krantz and Danielle Steele as bestsellers whose works will be deservedly forgotten in the next generation. So now you know what kind of person S.T. Joshi is, but he's a good scholar, and this is a pretty good collection of stories. So in his introduction, Joshi raises quite the interesting point. He talks about why there needs to be a compilation of only American authors, and his point is that when serious horror fiction started in Europe, Europe could draw on its rich history, like the Dark Middle Ages or the Gothic time, for example. America didn't have this rich history, so all the authors in here had to find more inventive ways, other than just drawing on history to write their horror stories. And I think most of the authors in here do that quite interestingly and convincingly. The stories themselves are ordered by release date. The first one is The Adventure of the German Student by Washington Irving and was released in 1824. And the most recent one is In the Waterworks by Caitlin R. Kiernan, and was released in 2000. And remember, this was released in 2007, so 2000 is pretty recent for an anthology like this. Most of the authors are pretty well known. Just to name the most famous ones, there's Edgar Allan Poe, H.P. Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, Robert Bloch, August Derleth, Ray Bradbury, Shirley Jackson, Richard Matheson, Stephen King, Thomas Ligotti, Joyce Carol Oates and Caitlin R. Kiernan. Two criticisms I have right from the start is the first one, there's only very few women in here. Of the 26 authors, there's only 2 women and 1 non-binary person. And the other criticism is that the authors are very white. I think the only non-white person in this book is S.T. Joshi himself, who has compiled all those stories. What he also did is quite the nice feature. In front of every story, there are a few paragraphs, mostly 2 pages, about the author of the story, the main points of their life, and then a few stories they've written and what they are basically famous for, and then directly after that comes the short story. And with that said, let's delve into the book. I want to talk about 3 short stories in here. I try to summarize at least the beginning of the stories and give you my thoughts on why I chose those stories. The first one is The Yellow Sign by Robert W. Chambers, which was published in 1985 in his first and most famous short story collection, which is The King in Yellow, which I actually have here. I have this edition. I actually thought this was a Penguin edition because of the stripe here, but it isn't. Anyways, Robert W. Chambers and his King in Yellow had a huge influence on horror. For example, H.P. Lovecraft used the King in Yellow in his stories and kind of integrated him into the Cthulhu mythos. I actually, when I first heard about the story collection, I thought the King in Yellow was written by H.P. Lovecraft, but it wasn't. Maybe it was because of the tabletop games I played at the time. But yes, I thought that Lovecraft wrote those stories. The King in Yellow itself, who is named also Hastur, is an invention of Ambrose Bierce, who also has a story in this book. And with that, you probably notice that authors always borrowed from each other. So the story itself is 20 pages long, and it features an artist who is painting his muse, who works as a model. And they kind of have this flirty thing going, but as the story progresses, they become more and more uneasy and unnerved because they have strange dreams, and then they see a graveyard watchman who also appeared in their dreams, which only adds to their confusion and general uneasiness. And what I found quite interesting is that you as a reader become more and more uneasy as the characters become more and more uneasy. And that despite nothing bad happening. Like, okay, they have bad dreams and there's this graveyard watchman, but there's not actually something to be afraid. And then the muse gives the artist something which has a never really defined yellow sign on it. And the yellow sign is, of course, the sign of Hastur, the king in yellow. And I don't want to talk about the story further because there is something happening in the end, but I just wanted to say that I really found it interesting that you as the reader become really, really uneasy while reading this story. So the reasons why I chose this story is that despite being so influential, he's not that known by many people. And like I said in the beginning, I thought The King in Yellow was written by Lovecraft. I think one of the problems is that he's kind of overshadowed by Edgar Allan Poe, who died 50 years before he wrote his stories, and then by H.P. Lovecraft, who started writing stories 30 years after. But those two are real pillars of early horror, and you don't hear much about Chambers. And the other reason is I found the story was really, really well written, and the use as the uneasiness of the characters as the vehicle to make the reader feel more uneasy was really, really great. Yeah, and all in all, I really did enjoy the story. So let's get to the next story. The next story I want to talk about is The Foghorn by Ray Bradbury. Ray Bradbury is probably mostly known for his book Fahrenheit 451 or for his involvement in several movies. But he's also released a huge body of short fiction. And the short stories are always somewhere in the speculative fiction genre, but he has written some stories that touch horror at least a bit. And one of those stories is The Foghorn. The Foghorn was published in 1951, and it's about 10 pages long. We follow two men who work at a lighthouse. They're sounding the foghorn, and then one day the older one of them remarks something like, "Oh, it's almost time again." And you may ask, time for what? Well, there may or may not be a creature that's coming from the depth of the ocean to this lighthouse, and I may or may not have been on the edge of my seat the whole time because I was so scared for the lives of those two men. It's a really, really good story. I liked it very much. It was also made into a movie which was called The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, and if you believe it or not, there's also an early Pokemon episode based on this story. And this is basically why I wanted to talk about this. And the other reason being, there's a lot of authors in here who have not only written books or short stories, but have worked in television and are famous for other things as well. So the last story I want to talk about is actually the last story in this book. It's called In the Waterworks, Birmingham, Alabama, 1888, and was written by Caitlin R. Kiernan. It was released in 2000 in one of their short story collection, and it's about 14 pages long. Kiernan was actually born in Ireland, but they moved to the US when they were really, really little, I think like 5 years or something. Kiernan also went on to become a paleontologist, which is kind of exciting for me as someone who has a degree in geology, and they often use their knowledge of science when writing their weird stories. And this story actually is a perfect example of that. So the setup for the story is that there's this man, Mr. Wallace, who works at a site where they drill a tunnel for the local waterworks, and he found something in there, and he comes with a small bottle to Mr. Matthews, who's a teacher for geography and math, but he also has a huge background in geology. They talk about what Mr. Wallace found in the tunnel, and in the small bottle is a thing that's not really described. I mean, they're said that it has something like chitinous texture, and that it can coil and uncoil. So in my mind, it's something like a small worm or a tentacle or something like that. Mr. Matthews is instantly interested in that and says, "Show me where you found this." And I don't really want to talk more about the story because you have to find out for yourselves how the story ends. But I chose this story not only because it's the last story in this book, and not only because it's written by a binary person who was born in Ireland, but mostly because of the paleontology or geology part, which I can really identify with. And Lovecraft himself used a lot of geology in his works, and I always liked that, like the blend of science and weird or cosmic horror, and this is something we find in this story. And with that said, I want to give you my final review. I really did enjoy the story, although it's very wide and very manly. I think it's still a great collection. There were only a few stories I didn't really like, but most of them were great, and a few of them were like really great. Even the longer ones, there's a longer one in here. It's by TED or Ted Klein, and it's called The Events at Porth Farm, where there's a young man at a farm, and he reads a lot. And I learned a lot about literature, or about horror literature, while reading this story. I found that really interesting. And I've read stories of authors I've never read before. I've read a lot of Stephen King, but I've never read a short story collection by him. So yeah, I really enjoyed this anthology. I very much liked that we had this small blurbs of the lives of the authors before the stories, because I very much think that the lives of authors influence how you experience the story, or how you should experience the story. So I don't really believe in the death of the author, which is a discussion for another video, I think. But yeah, I think I've said everything I wanted to say. Let me know if you liked my review. Let me know if you've read something by these authors, if you actually read stories by those authors, and tell me how you enjoyed their stories. And with that, goodbye and see you next time.